graffiti-stained walls, cracked sidewalks, and the heavy, rhythmic boom of drums echoing through the New York night. The air in Brooklyn during the early 90 seconds didn't just smell of smoke and cheap liquor, it smelled of a volatile kind of ambition. In the heart of that urban chaos, a persona was born that would eventually outgrow the man himself. His name was Russell Tyrone Jones, but the record shows the world would come to package, profit from, and ultimately step back from him under the name Ol' Dirty Bastard. When the Wu-Tang Clan emerged in 1993, they were described as an army of 9 generals, each with a distinct blade. But standing in the center of that collective genius was a man no one could predict, and as the files suggest, no one could truly contain. To the public, he was a spectacle. He didn't just rap, he erupted. He delivered his verses with the fervor of a street preacher and the raw pain of a man who saw too much. With his gold teeth flashing and hair braided into wild crowns, ODB walked on stage like a man who owned the world, yet looked like he was ready to watch it burn. But behind the manic laughter was a complex, systemic reality. This case isn't about a wild rapper or a mad clown of hip-hop. It's about what happens when mental health, addiction, and extreme fame collide without a safety net. There are news accounts from 1998 that provide a rare glimpse into the man behind the myth. While the cameras captured a madman interrupting the Grammys to shout about the children, local reports from just 24 hours earlier told a different story. They described a man who, along with a friend, helped pull a 4-year-old girl from beneath a burning car in Brooklyn, proof that the Madman narrative was never the whole story. This leads us to the core of our investigation. On one side, we have the myth, the unpredictable, dirty bastard, who became a tabloid punchline. On the other, we have the record, a man struggling with a documented history of psychological fractures, living under a 281-page shadow of FBI surveillance. The question we are investigating tonight isn't just how he lived, but why the support systems around him remained silent as the spiral tightened. By the time he collapsed in a Manhattan studio in 2004, the story had already been written by the headlines. But the details of that day and the years leading up to it left questions hanging in the air of hip-hop that have never truly been settled. Tonight, we strip away the performance to find Russell Jones. We examine how the system that packaged his chaos for profit was the same one that failed to provide an exit ramp when the chaos got too real. From the grime of the 36 chambers to a death that remains a subject of intense controversy, this is the investigative file on the wild heart of Wu-Tang. Grab your breath. We're going into the record of a man who was far more human than the legend allowed him to be. To understand the man the world called a bastard, we have to look at the child the system called Rusty. Before the FBI files and the high-speed chases, there was simply Russell Tyrone Jones, born the 15th of November 1968. If you look at the early record, Russell's background doesn't fit the typical broken home profile often associated with street legends. He was raised by Cherry and William Jones in a working-class pocket of Brooklyn. This is a critical detail for any investigator. Russell grew up in a household defined by civil service. His mother worked as a police dispatcher. His father drove for the New York Transit Authority. He was a child of structure, of rules, and of parents who understood the gears of the city. Yet, the reports from his youth describe a boy who was fundamentally at odds with any form of forced order. He was one of 6 children, but those who knew him say he occupied a space of his own. He hated boundaries. He treated school like an optional suggestion, showing up late with mismatched clothes and a grin that signaled he was tuned into a frequency no one else could hear. His mother nicknamed him Rusty because, in her words, he was always dirty. But this wasn't just about physical dirt. It was about a refusal to be polished, a rejection of the clean image the world demanded of young black men in the 60 seconds and 70 seconds. Inside that restless boy, however, burned a specific genetic gift: music. The Jones family may have been short on cash, but they were rich in rhythm. His mother sang in the church. His brother Ramsey was a professional drummer. Music didn't just play in their house, it lived in the walls. By age 11, Russell was already performing, reportedly lying about his age to get onto club stages. There were accounts that a local label offered him a contract even then, but Cherry Jones turned it down. She wanted him in the classroom. Russell wanted the stage. The record suggests this was the first significant fracture. It was the moment the structured world of his parents collided with his internal drive for absolute freedom. When his parents eventually divorced, the thin line holding Russell's world together snapped. He turned to the streets of Brooklyn in the late 70s, precisely when a new, unrefined sound called hip-hop was taking its first breaths. He didn't just listen to the music, he consumed it. He spent his nights breakdancing and beatboxing, honing a style that was erratic and raw. This wasn't just hobbyism. For Russell, it was a survival strategy against the creeping chaos of a city being hollowed out by economic decline. It was during this era that the All In Together Now crew was formed. Russell found his mirrors in his two cousins, Robert Diggs, who would become RZA, and Gary Grice, later known as Jeezy. The three were inseparable. While other kids were running crews for profit, they were recording homemade beats on cassette decks and studying 5% Nation philosophy, a complex system of mathematics and street wisdom. But even within this group of geniuses, Russell was the outlier. Investigators of the Wu-Tang's early days note that while RZA and Jeezy were obsessed with the technical perfection of the craft, Russell was obsessed with the feeling. He would freestyle with a disturbing intensity, then suddenly dissolve into laughter or jump off the stage. He wasn't interested in being a rapper, he wanted to be a revelation. By the mid-1980s, the system tried to absorb them. Both RZA and Jeezy signed early record deals, and both were essentially robbed by the industry's predatory contracts. Russell watched from the sidelines as the business of music chewed up his family. He saw the lies of the gatekeepers and the cold reality that the industry wasn't built for men like him, not for those who refused to play the role of the well-behaved artist. In that rejection, the old dirty bastard was truly born. He took the name from an old kung fu film, but the spirit was entirely his own. He famously stated, "There's no father to his style." It was a declaration of independence from everything, from his father's structured life, from the music industry's rules, and from the expectations of society. Russell Jones had become a mirror of the chaos he saw around him. But beneath the wild exterior, the boy named Rusty remained a boy who was raised to respect the law by his dispatcher mother, but who found that the law didn't always respect him. This internal conflict would become the engine of his brilliance, and ultimately, the catalyst for his demise. The stage was set. The blueprint of rebellion was complete. Now, the world was about to meet the man who refused to be a statistic, only to find that the system had already opened a file with his name on it. By the late 1980s, New York City was a battleground of beats and concrete. Crack smoke drifted through the streets like a ghost, and the sound of the city was changing. In that chaos, three cousins were quietly sharpening their swords. RZA, Jeezy, and Russell Jones, now fully embodying the persona of Old Dirty Bastard, were ready to build something the world had never seen. They had already tried to play by the system's rules, and lost. RZA and Jeezy had been chewed up by early predatory contracts, an experience that fueled a new, radical plan. RZA told them, "We're gonna form a group. 9 generals. One sound." They called it Wu-Tang Clan, inspired by the Shaolin Kung Fu films they watched in Grindhouse Theaters movies, where warriors fought for honor and survival against overwhelming odds. Wu-Tang wasn't just a rap group, it was hip-hop as a martial art. Every verse was a blade, and in the center of it all was ODB, the soul of the army, raw and unpredictable. When they released Protect Ya Neck in 1993, the industry didn't know how to react. It was grimy, unapologetic, and completely disconnected from the polished radio sound of the era. They sold the records out of car trunks, fueling an underground fire that New York couldn't ignore. But as the W symbol began to appear on every block from Brooklyn to Staten Island, it caught the attention of more than just fans. This is where the case file takes a dark, documented turn. In the eyes of the law, 9 black men from the projects achieving financial independence and cultural power wasn't a success story, it was a threat. The record now confirms that the FBI began compiling what would become a 281-page file on the Wu-Tang Clan. The Bureau didn't see artists, they saw a criminal enterprise. They monitored their travels, their business dealings, and their lyrics. And for a man as sensitive and volatile as Russell Jones, this surveillance wasn't just a legal nuisance, it was a psychological trigger. In November 1993, the world was introduced to the 36 Chambers. The album sounded like a riot recorded on tape. While RZA provided the structure and GZA the wisdom, ODB provided the pure, unadulterated energy. On tracks like Shame on a Nigga, he was a revelation, singing off-key, yelling and laughing through his verses. He was part preacher, part street prophet. The album went platinum, redefining East Coast hip-hop. But for ODB, the fame came with a suffocating shadow. The files suggest that the more the public cheered for his madness, the more the state intensified its gaze. Investigators of ODB's life often point to this period as the beginning of his documented paranoia. But when you have a 281-page FBI file detailing your every move, is it still paranoia? Or is it a rational reaction to being hunted? The dirty bastard persona was a shield, but the person underneath Russell Jones was beginning to fracture. He was a man who grew up with a police dispatcher for a mother, someone who understood the power of the state better than most. He knew the difference between a fan and a tail. He began to talk about government plots and secret agents, things the media laughed off as drug-induced rants. But the record shows he was right about one thing. The system was watching, and it was waiting for him to slip. The fame was a golden cage, and the bars were closing in. Wu-Tang ruled the airwaves, but the W had become a target. And as ODB stepped into the solo spotlight, the pressure was about to reach a boiling point. The world wanted the dirty version, but they weren't prepared for the cost of keeping it real. Fame didn't just arrive for old dirty bastard, it collided with him like a high-speed wreck. By 1995, following the seismic success of the Wu-Tang Clan, the music industry realized they had a lightning bolt in a bottle. They didn't want the strategic mastermind of RZA or the lyrical precision of Jeezy. They wanted the raw, unedited, and increasingly volatile chaos of the man the world was starting to call ODB. He signed a massive solo deal with Elektra Records and unleashed a masterpiece of sonic madness titled Return to the 36 Chambers, the Dirty Version. The record was an investigative study in human transparency. But it was the cover art that served as his first major indictment of the American system. ODB insisted on using a direct reproduction of his actual New York City food stamp card, complete with his identification photo and state-issued numbers. To the industry, it was a brilliant marketing gimmick, a piece of street theater. To Russell Jones, it was a survival record. It was his way of stating for the permanent record, you can give me a platinum plaque, but the system still sees me as a recipient of government aid, a man to be tracked, measured, and eventually cut off. On tracks like Shimmy Shimmy Ya and Brooklyn Zoo, his voice didn't just rap, it erupted like a fracture in the pavement. The album went platinum, and ODB became a global legend. However, in the world of true crime, this is what we identify as the commodification of crisis. The labels and the media didn't love the complexity of Russell Jones. They loved the chaos of the dirty bastard. They turned his undiagnosed mental fractures into a profitable hook. The more unpredictable he became, the more newspapers he sold, and the more records he moved. This was a man struggling with what many now believe were the early stages of schizophrenia, yet the world was treating his symptoms as a high-budget comedy routine. Nowhere was this surreal collision more evident than in his 1995 collaboration with pop icon Mariah Carey. When she reached out for the Fantasy remix, it was a move that would change pop music forever, blending sugary radio hits with the grittiness of the streets. But the investigative reality behind that studio session was a portrait of a man already losing his grip on the expectations of fame. Industry accounts of that day are haunting. ODB reportedly showed up nearly 3 hours late, heavily intoxicated, and refused to record until the label provided champagne and thousands of dollars in cash on the spot. He was frustrated, feeling like a circus act brought in to add edge to a pop song. Yet, even in that state, He delivered magic, immortalizing the line, "Me and Mariah go back like babies and pacifiers." The industry got their hit, but they ignored the evidence of a man spiraling. They didn't care about the cost to Russell. They only cared that the dirty version was good for the bottom line. As the money poured in, the shadow of the state grew longer. Between 1995 and 1998, the record shows a frantic, escalating cycle of legal run-ins, arrests for assault, drug rumors, and increasingly erratic public behavior began to clutter his file. To the public, it was entertainment. To an investigator, it was a desperate cry for help from a man trapped between a 281-page FBI file and the crushing weight of a caricature he had to perform every day just to keep his lights on. Then came the 1998 Grammy Awards, the night the myth of ODB was cemented in the American consciousness. The Wu-Tang Clan had lost the Best Rap Album award to Puffy Combs, a result that many in the hip-hop community felt was a snub to the raw culture they represented. While singer-songwriter Sean Colvin was on stage accepting the award for Song of the Year, ODB, dressed in a sharp, brand-new suit, decided he had seen enough. He stormed the stage, grabbed the microphone, and delivered a speech that would be replayed for decades. "Wu-Tang is for the children," he shouted. "Puffy is good, but Wu-Tang is the best. We want to teach the children." The crowd gasped. The industry laughed. The headlines the next morning labeled him a madman, a stage crasher, and a menace to society. But there is a factual detail in the timeline that the tabloids chose to bury. Just 24 hours before he stood on that stage, Russell Jones had been a hero in the truest sense. On a street in Brooklyn, he had witnessed a horrific car accident. While the world saw a rapper causing a scene at the Grammys, a 4-year-old girl was alive because Russell Jones and a friend had used their bare hands to lift a burning vehicle and pull her to safety. He had visited her in the hospital under a fake name to avoid the press. This is the central tragedy of the ODB investigative file. The system celebrated the hero in private, but prosecuted the madman in public. Russell Jones wanted to be a teacher, a savior, a voice for the children. But the fame machine only had room for the dirty bastard. Behind the flashing gold teeth and the wild laughter, the man was breaking. He began to believe the FBI was using the media to orchestrate his downfall, a fear that many dismissed as drug-induced paranoia. But as the arrests moved from minor misdemeanors to serious felonies, and the fantasy of fame turned into a nightmare of surveillance, it became clear that the system wasn't just watching him anymore. It was preparing to swallow him whole. The stage was set for a collapse that no amount of platinum records could prevent. The world wanted the show, but they weren't prepared for the final act. By the late 1992, the dirty bastard wasn't just a headline, he was a target. The investigative record shows a man being hunted by a legal system that had no interest in his brilliance, only his compliance. In 1999, after a series of escalating incidents, including a highly questionable arrest for wearing a bulletproof vest, which was deemed a felony because of his prior record, the trap finally snapped shut. Russell Jones was sentenced to 2 to 4 years in prison. For a mind already fracturing under the weight of undiagnosed trauma, it was a death sentence in slow motion. He was sent to Clinton Correctional Facility, a maximum security fortress in Dannemora, New York, a place built for the worst of the worst. To an investigator, the treatment of Russell Jones during this period is a textbook case of the systemic failure to handle mental health within the carceral state. Inside those walls, the madness didn't fade, it intensified. ODB began calling his family and his spiritual mentor, Papa Wu, with accounts that read like a conspiracy thriller. He claimed the guards were beating him in blind spots. He claimed other inmates were being paid to provoke him. But most chillingly, he began to report that he was being forced to take medication that made his mind feel like static. He told his mother, Cherry, "They're trying to put something inside me." While the prison staff recorded these as drug-induced delusions, those close to him saw a man being chemically restrained to keep him quiet. The record suggests that the system's response to his erratic behavior was not therapy, but more isolation. He spent long stretches in solitary confinement, the hole, where the only voice he could hear was his own, magnified by the cold stone walls. It was here that the last remnants of Russell Jones began to dissolve into the persona of ODB. The paranoia he had felt about the FBI surveillance now had a physical form in the shape of prison uniforms and iron bars. By the time he was released on parole in 2003, the man who walked out of the prison gates was a shadow of the general who had stormed the 36 chambers. The investigative footage from the VH1 documentary Inside Out, ODB on Parole, is a haunting piece of evidence. You see a man who is physically present but spiritually hollow. He smiles, he growls for the cameras, and he raps his famous lines, but the eyes are disconnected. He famously told the cameras that the hardest part of freedom was staying away from drugs because life without them is just too boring. What the world saw as a comeback was actually a frantic effort by the industry to squeeze the last bit of profit out of a dying engine. Dame Dash and Roc-A-Fella Records stepped in with $1 million deal, surrounding him with cameras and producers, while he was still struggling to distinguish between the voices in his head and the voices in the studio. The support system that should have been a medical one was instead a commercial one. They wanted the dirty back, but they didn't realize that the bastard was all that was left. Russell Jones was drowning, and the people holding the life rafts were too busy filming the sinking for the evening news. The incarceration of his body had ended, but the incarceration of his mind was now complete. The countdown to the 13th of November 2004 had officially begun. By November 2004, the man the world knew as Old Dirty Bastard was operating on a borrowed timeline. The investigative record of his final weeks reveals a disturbing truth. The comeback, heralded by Roc-A-Fella Records, was less a redemption and more a commercial extraction. Russell Jones was living under the crushing weight of parole conditions, constant media surveillance, and a mind that had been chemically altered by years of prison medication. He was back in the studio, the one place that should have been his sanctuary, but it had become another cell. Reports from his final sessions describe a man who was physically deteriorating slower in his speech, struggling with his breathing, yet still pushed to deliver the dirty energy that sold records. On the 13th of November 2004, just 2 days before his 36th birthday, the spin finally reached its terminal point. Russell was at RZAA's 36 Chambers studio in Manhattan, working on new material. Witnesses in the room noted that he complained of chest pains and a racing heart. To an investigator, this is a critical red flag that was tragically ignored in the moment. In an environment defined by chaos, a cry for help is often mistaken for just another ODB moment. Minutes later, the wild heart of the Wu-Tang Clan stopped. Russell Jones collapsed on the studio floor. The official autopsy report was released shortly after, an accidental overdose of cocaine and the prescription painkiller tramadol. On the surface, it seemed like a standard rock star tragedy. But in the world of true crime, we look deeper than the toxicology report. How does a man who was under intense federal and parole supervision, a man who was reportedly trying to clean up his life for his children, end up with a lethal combination of drugs in a professional environment? The questions began to swirl immediately. Those close to him, including his wife Iceline Jones and his mother Cherry, didn't just see an accident, they saw a failure of protection. The investigation into his final hours reveals a vacuum of care. Russell had spent years telling anyone who would listen that the system was trying to kill him. We dismissed it as paranoia. But when a man is treated as a commodity rather than a patient, when his psychological fractures are used as marketing assets instead of being treated by professionals, the line between accidental death and systemic neglect disappears. The record suggests that the industry was more interested in the 100 songs he had recorded for his posthumous album than they were in the heart rate of the man recording them. Even in death, the exploitation didn't cease. His estate immediately became a battlefield of royalties, rights, and legal disputes, while his body was barely cold. Russell Jones died with a faint smile on his face, according to some reports perhaps finally finding the freedom that the streets of Brooklyn and the lights of the Grammys never gave him. But for the world of hip-hop, the silence he left behind was deafening. He was 35 years old, the same age as many of the men the FBI had tracked during the COINTELPRO era. As we close the file on the death of ODB, we are forced to confront a haunting reality. The system didn't need to plant a chip in his brain or hire an assassin. It simply had to watch him struggle, keep the cameras rolling, and wait for the weight of the dirty bastard to eventually crush the soul of Russell Jones. The terminal spin was over, but the echoes of his final heartbeat were about to turn into a legacy that no system could ever silence. Art has a cold way of outliving the hands that created it. But when the dust of the music industry settles, and the profit margins of the 1,990 seconds are long forgotten, what remains are the voices that refuse to be silenced. The investigation into the life of Russell Jones doesn't end with a toxicology report or an FBI file. It ends with a debt of dignity that the world still owes to the man they called a bastard. Even after his death, Old Dirty Bastard refused to fade away. You can still feel him in the bass lines of modern hip-hop, in the chaos of the underground, and in every artist who dares to break the rules of the corporate machine. ODB wasn't just a part of hip-hop history. He was its raw, unpolished soul. He left behind no perfect image, no sanitized legacy. What he left was truth, and as we've seen in this investigation, truth is rarely pretty. In an era when the industry demanded perfection and compliance, Russell Jones gave them imperfection and rebellion. When they wanted silence, he gave them madness. When they wanted a predictable product, he gave them a human soul. That is why his name still echoes through artists who color outside the lines, who rap off beat, and who live on their own terms. From the eccentricity of Young Thug to the creative defiance of Kanye West or Tyler, the Creator, the DNA of Russell Jones is everywhere. He paved the way for every misfit with a microphone, teaching the world that genius doesn't come with polish, it comes with pain. The record shows that his son, Young Dirty Bastard, carries that fire, now keeping the madness sacred on stages across the world. Rizza still refers to him as the spirit of freedom in its purest form. And perhaps that is the ultimate finding of our investigation. ODB was freedom personified, a man who lived without a safety net in a world that was constantly trying to cage him. He wasn't a villain, and he wasn't a saint. He was the voice of every broken dreamer who refused to bow down to a system that didn't see their value. The man who stood on that Grammy stage and shouted, "Wu-Tang is for the children." That was never just a line for the cameras. It was a prophecy. Because decades later, the children are still listening. They study his verses, his interviews, and his laughter, trying to understand a man who could make you laugh, cry, and question the foundations of society in the same breath. Russell Jones didn't die in that studio on 34th Street. He transformed into myth, into music, and into a permanent reminder that even in chaos, there is beauty. Even in madness, there is profound meaning. His story is a testament to the fact that dignity doesn't need the world's applause, and real art, the kind that shakes the soul, never truly dies. As we close this case file, we are reminded that the system may have broken the man, but it could never touch the spirit. Russell "Rusty" Jones was the wild heart of Shaolin, a storm that the world wasn't ready for, but a storm that hip-hop will never forget. The investigation is closed, but the legacy? That is just beginning. Rest in power, Russell. The world finally hears you.